Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harmon, the President and CEO. Very pleased I don't work in my last position, and love it here for the past 7 years. This event is being webcast, I believe, or yes?
Yes.
So hello to audiences I can't actually see, but we have a full house today. We also, I hope she's here, have Hala Esfandiari. Is Hala here? We do not have Hala Esfandiari, but I wanted to acknowledge her as the original and unbelievably impressive head of our Middle East program. I also want to acknowledge that this is the second event on Iran that we have conducted in a week. And some of you may have called into our ground truth briefing last week on the protests in Iran. It was focused on that subject. A number of impressive participants, moderated by Aaron David Miller. But one of those participants, Robin Wright, is also part-time here and part-time at USIP. And I just want to give a shout out to Robin, who is an amazingly astute observer on Iran. So today's event is co-sponsored by the International Crisis Group, which is releasing its annual report on Iran. I'm not sure if we physically have that report or it's coming. Yes, we do. Okay. We physically have the report of the International Crisis Group. We're always pleased to work with them. Very smart outfit. But today's event is even sweeter because we get to welcome the new president and CEO of ICG, Rob Malley. And I want to give a shout out to Rob. He's known probably to all of you. He's known especially to Aaron. But he held every job related to the Middle East in the Obama White House, including a stint at the NSC. He's a prolific author. He has prior experience with this group, and he's a very good friend of the Wilson Center. So, Rob, we're thrilled. In fact, I just would like to ask for some applause for Rob. Okay. So, the title of today's event, Raised Stakes: U.S. Policy Toward Iran in 2008, is apt. This is not just a conversation about the protests, and there were and maybe more protests in Iran. This is not just about the JCPOA, although I'm sure that will come up. But it is a broader look and a deeper look, something we're very good at here, about Iran and the region. And it follows the news last Friday that nobody missed, which is that to the great relief of many, including me, our president did not withdraw us from the JCPOA. He did, however, issue a statement, and I'm sure it will be discussed, which included language like, this is the last chance, and he called on Europe to be much more forceful in demanding a deal beyond the expiration of this deal, and to deal with constraining Iran's missile development, proliferation of missiles, cyber threats, and destabilizing actions in the Middle East. And frankly, on that piece, I think many of us agree. More and longer actions are a good idea. Today's panel will not be a presentation of speeches. It will be a conversation with Aaron Miller, who, as most of you know, is our Vice President for New Initiatives and directs our Middle East program. Aaron's experience is also legendary, serving 6 secretaries of state and doing a variety of other things in the government and the private sector, including president of Seeds of Peace, which I certainly thought and think is a heroic effort to bring understanding between Israelis and Palestinians. A couple of final comments. And we forget this at our peril, and it is different from other states in the Middle East. Iran is one of the great world civilizations. The Persian civilization was extraordinary. The Persian people are extraordinary. And understanding some of that and understanding Iran's pride, I think, is useful to and helpful to an understanding of the region. That's number one. Number two, there's an enormous Iranian diaspora in the United States. I know that because I'm from Los Angeles. My congressional district was in Los Angeles, which some call Terror Angeles. There are 800,000 Iranians living in Los Angeles. So there's a huge connection in that way between Iran and the U.S. Third point, and people stress this, but then people forget it. Our issues are with the government of Iran and its conduct, not with the people of Iran. And I think every way we can think that and say that helps to build bridges to a great civilization and an important population group in the United States. So I just thought I'd put that out there. It's certainly the way I try to think about it. It's a very complicated issue. We will begin to unpack a lot of it right now. Please welcome our moderator, Aaron David Miller, who will reintroduce Rob and introduce the rest of the panel.
Jane, thanks so much, and thanks to all of you. Jane, in particular, thanks for your warm, wise, and wonderful words. I'm hoping that this is going to be the first of many in a series of collaborative efforts with ICG under the direction of its new president and CEO, Rob Malley, who is a close friend of mine and a colleague in the pursuit of many Mission Impossibles. Maybe one day one of those Mission Impossibles will become possible. Rob needs no introduction, either to the other two. You have all their bios. We're also delighted to welcome Ali Vaaz, who heads ICG's Iran project and is a frequent contributor, thank you, Ali, to Wilson Center events, and to Laura Secor, a freelance journalist who came to us from New York. She's the author of Children of Paradise, The Struggle for the Soul of Iran, and a extremely prescient and thoughtful piece in the New York Times on January 6th, which talks about the Iranian people's thirst, demand, and eagerness for accountability. Iran is a huge topic and very opaque with respect to what's happening on the ground. So I made an executive decision that we would concentrate on U.S. policy. But like with most of our policies, it's important to begin with a sense of ground truth on what's actually happening in Iran to the degree that we understand it. That's going to be the first issue of inquiry. We're going to spend until 4 pursuing 3 compartments of U.S. policy toward Iran. And let me just say, I would like to hear from all the panelists. The answer to the question is, does the administration a year in have an Iran policy? And if not, what might be an effective and wise one? I'd only say that it's, and I voted for Republicans and Democrats and worked for Republicans and Democrats. This is just an observation that the administration's policy seems, after a year, to be preternaturally guided by domestic politics, in large part by the desire for the president to be the un-Obama. I would argue also that rhetoric, by and large, has exceeded action with respect to actually implementing a policy. And when it comes to Iran, the point of departure appears to be that the JCPOA, which I would argue is functional but flawed, in the view of the administration, is fundamentally flawed, and that it has hamstrung and held hostage an effort to broaden U.S. policy to deal with other aspects of Iran's behavior in the region. Finally, I think that the Trump administration has in part created a new axis of evil. Iraq is now no longer a member, and North Korea and Iran appear to be senior members. And one final comment before we get to the issue of Iran internal, and that is this. However blustery and tough the rhetoric, this is now the third certification or decision point to waive sanctions. The administration has decided in all 3 to allow the deal to stand. And despite very tough rhetoric about confronting, if not rolling back, Iran's role in the region, and that will be a part of this discussion, its actual policies have been fairly risk averse and quite cautious in places like Iraq and in Syria. So there is this notion after a year that the policy is quite ambiguous and in many respects confused. Whether that will remain the case or not is unclear. So let's start with the first compartment, which is the issue of Iranian internal, which is going to be a challenge for the administration in the months to come. And this is an Iranian moment. I've written that. I think that's a matter of common sense. So let me start with Ali and Laura. Ali, perhaps you'd like to go first. What is the headline, the takeaway on what is happening on the ground in Iran, and what might the trend lines be? Much harder to define.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and Jane, for having us here. You start with maybe one of the most difficult questions, because I think we have to be humble in how much we understand the drivers of the recent protests in Iran. We have to admit that we were mostly surprised by the recent round of protests, but I will make a few observations. Number one, I think the protests have been contained, but the drivers of these protests have not. And that means that unless the system in Iran agrees to some kind of evolutionary change, there might be more motivation within the population to move towards more radical revolutionary change. Because some of these issues cannot be resolved by their own, or cannot be resolved by superficial reform. They really require structural reform. That the Iranian people, by going to the polls over the past 25 years and voting for the reformists, have actually demonstrated that they would welcome gradual change to address some of these issues that have resulted in economic disgruntlement, chronic unemployment issues, etc. And then the second point is, if you look at the drivers of the recent round of protests, it's actually quite interesting. In 90% of the 80 cities, nearly 80 cities that experienced unrest, these cities had experienced some kind of protest in 2017 over bread and butter issues mostly. Retirees had protested because they had lost their savings. Students had protested. Environmentalists had protested because Iran actually this year is experiencing an unprecedented drought. It hasn't been this worse in the past 50 years. Their air pollution is a major issue. So it was a combination of a perfect storm, if you want. After a year of coming to the street, dashed expectations because the nuclear deal had not really delivered on its promises. And the trigger seemed to be economic disgruntlement, probably also fueled a little bit by the hardliners, because they would like to portray the Rouhani administration as incapable of delivering on its economic promises. Because remember, Rouhani's main promise in the first term was to resolve the nuclear issue and lift the sanctions. In the second term, he now has to show the results of the investment he did in the first term. And they want the hardliners, through everything they had at him in the presidential elections last May. They didn't succeed, and now they're trying to undermine him in other ways. If you look at Iranian television, for example, every single day there are stories and interviews with people in the street who complain about how incapable the government is of addressing their issues. And the government, without any doubt, has failed a lot. But what the television doesn't say, national state television doesn't say, is that one reason Rouhani has not been able to deliver is because the deep state in Iran, the unelected institutions, have obstructed reform. And this is not, again, limited to the Rouhani administration. It has happened over the past 20 years. I think the reaction of the system to the protest is quite interesting, because if you compare it to 2009, it was much milder in terms of the crackdown on the protests. And this might have several reasons. One reason might be that because it was more scattered, more shallow, more provincial than 2009, so it wasn't as much of a threat. It might be because the system didn't want to alienate the Europeans that they need at this stage in order to protect the nuclear deal. It might be because protests happened in areas that are the system's constituencies. Or it might be simply because they've become smarter over the years. But I think one thing is clear, that if you look at the leadership in Iran, which are the original revolutionaries, right? These are the Jacobins who came to power in 1979. And every decade since then, they have experienced a major uprising in Iran. I think they probably understand that the Iranian population is not a restive population. This is a country that had two major revolutions in the past century. And these issues will require structural reform. Now, the supreme leader is 80 years old at this stage, and presiding over an 80 million country, and he might be reluctant to do structural change, because structural change by definition could be destabilizing. Rouhani too, I think, might be reluctant, because maybe he wants to become supreme leader and succeed the supreme leader, and as such doesn't want to rock the boat. Structural change, again, is painful by definition. So we have to see, but at the same time, I think the system understands that if it wants to survive, it needs to undergo some change. But how it will do it, or whether it will do it, is the main question.
Yeah, and Laura, let me just pick up on Ali's theme. You talked about accountability in your superb op-ed in the Times. How would accountability actually be measured in terms of satisfying the needs of middle-class, lower-middle-class Iranians, given all of the structural impediments that Ali has identified?
Yeah. Well, I think the Iranian regime, it has two problems that are interrelated. One is political and the other is economic. And in both areas, the regime has come under considerable pressure. And I think to say that, we don't need to know absolute numbers of people who are protesting in the streets, people who have this or that opinion on one or another policy. What we do see is every decade or so, some kind of protest movement. We do see the electoral landscape being shaped by a demand for greater openness politically, and for the improvement in economic indicators that have been consistently declining or flat. So specifically, unemployment is an issue that I know I've been hearing about in Iran since I started going there in 2004, and it has not really seen much improvement in the course of a long period of time. Inflation has declined in the last year, but is still an issue. And these kinds of things stem from deeper structural problems, which I think one sees an increasing tendency to say that, this is not being resolved with minor measures. And on the economy, it's long been thought that the kinds of reforms that need to be made they go to the core of interests that are held at the heart of the deep state. So it's hard to talk about economic reform without challenging the political system as well. And yeah.
Sorry, a question for the two of you before we move on to Rob and how the Trump administration has reacted to events over the last couple of weeks. Ali interestingly talked about evolutionary as opposed to revolutionary change, two revolutions in a century. One could argue that that's, in the modern day and age, that's quite a lot. But the notion of Iran as most people wanting evolutionary change suggests they understand and respect the repressive powers of the state. They watch what happened in June of 2009. They don't want to court those. But for both of you, is it possible that the so-called Arab Spring, which held so much promise in its initial months in early 2011 and then led to dysfunction, chaos, and civil war in at least 4 states, and that remains, those 4 states, Yemen, Libya, Iraq, and Syria, remain varying degrees of dysfunction, that this has an impact at all on how Iranian public, to the degree that it speaks with any sort of unified voice, perceives how things change?
I would argue absolutely. It's interesting. The most prevalent hashtag on Twitter during the protests was that Iran will not become Syria. And if you imagine that that Twitter is probably mostly used by the middle class, it's an indication of the fact that the middle class is very reluctant, understands the grievances and sympathizes with the grievances of the population writ large, but is very afraid of chaos that what comes with facing the system on the streets. This is both because of the Arab uprisings, because of the 2009 experience, and I would argue because of also the 1979 experience that is still very fresh in the minds of many within the population. And I think the Iranians still suffer from the same malady that was there in 1979, which is that they are very clear on what they dislike or don't want, but they don't know what they want. You look at the slogans on the streets, it's ranged from complaints about the price of eggs to Iran's role in Syria, all the way to regime change. And I think that's one of the reasons that these round of protests didn't really go far, as well as in 2009, one can argue. But at the end of the day, there is another phenomenon that I think the system should make particular attention to, which is the fact that one of the governors of one of the provinces said 90%, 95% of the people that we arrested are under the age of 25. Now, for that cohort, the 1979 experience is not that relevant. Maybe even 2009 experience is not that relevant. If you look at the unemployment rate when it gets to youth unemployment, is between 30 and 40%. So that's the group that could be dangerous for the system down the road if it really fails to address their concerns.
Lord, let me just adjust this in one way. The trope here in Washington and in certain quarters, and certainly in the Trump administration, and I'm certainly not here to write a brief for the repressive nature of this regime, is that, in fact, it is a repressive, extractive regime. It's ideological. It's bent on pacifying and placating the elites which support it, and that it has little regard for any equitable distribution of state resources for the vast majority of its people. And some characterizations here in Washington are worse than that. My question is, can you provide any sense of what the Iranian public, how they perceive this regime? And are any of the Washington tropes that are trotted out to describe how the Iranian public feels about the regime, are they accurate?
Well, first, I just want to say I cannot generalize the views of the entire population of Iran, so I'm not going to pick that up. But I think that it is fair to say that it is a repressive regime, and that you will encounter a large number of people in Iran who feel that it is irredeemable. On the other hand, they participate in politics. And this seems like a contradiction, and at times it's almost baffling, because you see people who, after I don't know how many elections passed where one said the reform movement is over, nobody will come out and vote for reformists, this thing has cashed out. It never seems to. People come out and vote in large numbers when there is a candidate in the race who they think might carry a germ of change. And that does suggest that there is, I don't want to say that it tells us that the population is deeply believes in the legitimacy of the government. I think that you have people using the leverage that they have instrumentally. You do have people who see the system as reformable, and then you have people who simply see their vote as a bit of leverage that they have in a game that is that's heavily stacked, but that nonetheless does have room for participation. So one of the things that I really just always emphasize about Iran that is that's maybe bewildering to those who see it as a monolith in this country, but is also just key to understanding it, is that this is a country that has a culture of civic activism and civic engagement that does not seem to be crushed by the repressive nature of the regime. And that's something that generates hope, because even in more recent elections after 2009, in 2009 you really saw the political spectrum narrow pretty dramatically with the suppression of the Green Movement. The fact that Iranian voters came out to vote for Rouhani in 2013 was already a surprise, that you would have this constituency that had seen its mainstream political leaders from the old elite imprisoned and tortured and forced to confess. These people then come out and they say, no, we're still going to keep trying to push this system even an inch to the left of where it is. And that seems to be, that seems to happen again and again. Now, what we've seen this winter may be that this spectrum, which has now come to a much more centrist space. The left of the spectrum is not where the left used to be. If we want to use left and right, it's not a perfect analog in Iran at all. You may be seeing that there's a constituency that is not satisfied with the outcome of this kind of strategic voting, and that does not feel that ultimately this is getting them the kinds of change that they want to see. But I think that's, there's always been, even in 2009, one of the things that I've been sort of questioning as I'm watching the coverage of these more recent protests, we're being told that these are qualitatively different from in the past because it's a different demographic, it's geographically distributed differently, and the slogans are more radical. Now, all of these things are remarkable if true. We have limits to what we can truly know and generalize about them. But I think it's also the case that the Green movement and the reform movement before it, what we had in the 90s and in 2009, that movement was disciplined and channeled through a faction of the elite, the reform faction, which was all about incremental evolutionary change. But it was a broad coalition, and it pulled people in who had more radical views, and it pulled people in who had more conservative views. It was able to bridge the inside and what could have fallen to the outside of the spectrum. That was always an uneasy coalition because there were agendas that were not totally in harmony.
Thank you. Rob, before we move on to Iran's role in the region, let me ask you a question about U.S. policy. It's an Iranian moment. Any sensible person would see that, particularly given our track record in interceding, the lack of success we've had in trying to manipulate internal politics of other countries. But is there any room in this Iranian moment for an American moment? Is there anything we could be doing in order to, I'm not even so sure what. We're not encouraging the demonstrators to go out into the streets. We're avoiding the precedent, unfortunately, however well-intentioned, George H.W. Bush in 1991 called upon Iraqis, Kurds, and Shia to rise up and then wouldn't or couldn't protect them when Saddam moved to slaughter them. We're not calling for regime change, it seems to me, with a possible exception of a presidential tweet or two. So what should we be doing?
First, I want to thank you and Jane and the Wilson Center for welcoming us. I think you got to build on what Ali and Laura said, and then really take a step back. And so I think you commented on this in the past. So much of the debate on this issue has been distorted, first of all, by our ignorance, not just of Iran, but more generally, we've failed to predict so many of the events or to assess them correctly, whether they were in Tunisia or in Egypt or in Libya or in Syria. And in Iran, it's compounded by such an ideological prism through which people view events there that it really did look like an intramural American sport more than what was completely detached often from what was happening in Iran in at least two ways. One is the interpretation of the events themselves, and I think we've heard here probably two of the most subtle and sophisticated analyses. There have been others, but so many of them were just projecting ideological hopes about what would happen in Iran. So the notion that this was a sort of maybe the end of the regime was going to fall based on so little other than, again, the hopes of those who were projecting those ideas, it doesn't do anyone any service. But I think there was so much hype because of that, and that is part ignorance, part deliberate, or not even deliberate, just projection of aspirations detached from reality. And it also had an effect on the whole debate about the U.S. role. Again, should the U.S. have done more in 2009? Should it do more now? I think, people who know Iran well would say, people who've been there a lot, and I don't count myself as one of them, it has almost no impact.
Right.
I mean, you could imagine U.S. interventions that would have a negative impact. It could be a negative American moment. The notion that if President Obama has said a little bit more, a little less, or if President Trump had said a little less or a little more, that it would have had any decisive, not even decisive, any significant or measurable impact on the course of events in Iran is really to misunderstand what was happening there. And again, just a reflection of our, sometimes this very peculiar American sport of thinking that it's all about us. I think Mark Lynch had a very interesting piece today in which he argues that Iran today is more like Tunisia 2018 and Tunisia 2011. And that, there are structural problems we heard. There also is sort of, a protest movement that we see happening elsewhere, and we have to put it in perspective and understand the depth of the discontent in Iran, but also the fact that that the presence of thousands of people on the street doesn't necessarily mean that the regime is by any means on its last legs. And also, the events should prove the fact that President Trump did take a different attitude from President Obama. That had no discernible impact on the events there. So hopefully, it would put an end to that myth that 2009 could have been a very different event if the administration had acted differently. I think we have to be more humble about our understanding and about the impact of what we say.
Yeah, here. I have one additional question, which I'm going to save, and that is Rouhani the new Gorbachev? But this trope has been floating around for a while, but I'll save that for the Q&A. So let's shift now to Iran's role in the region. And Rob, I want to start with you. I think King Abdullah of Jordan said that it's not a Shia crescent we're dealing with, it's a full moon. That Iran now exercises influence, varying degrees of influence, in 4 Arab capitals: Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sana'a, through proxies, through asymmetrical political influence and conflict. That Iran is rising in part in response to the dysfunction that exists in the Arab world, and some would argue because of retreating American posture in the region. So my question to you, Rob, is this. Is Iran a strategic threat to U.S. interests? Now, obviously, that would depend how you define them in the region.
So if I said earlier that one of our national pastimes is to project our own ideological debates onto Iran and the countries we follow, another national pastime is to hype threats and then mishandle them and in the process make them more serious. I think that's been true about our fight against terrorism. It was true about the way we dealt with Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. It's true about Iran. And that does lead, I'll come to it in a second, to misdiagnosis comes to bad prescriptions in terms of policy. Does Iran have an approach, a strategy, interest that are at odds with the U.S.? Of course. I mean, the Iranians would be the first to admit it. So, they're the ones who keep clamoring it. So I think it would be blind to say that Iran is not supporting groups that have an agenda that is opposed to the U.S., that is trying to gain influence at the expense not only of the U.S. but of its allies. How strategic, how existential that threat is, I think that's a different matter. And how new this is also a different matter. I mean, this notion of these 4 capitals, it kind of puzzles me. Iran had influence in Syria, as you know, for a long time. But the main point, I think, is that the factors that encourage, enable, promote Iranian influence are not the ones we think. And in fact, our actions and the actions of our allies often make things much worse from that perspective. The factor, I think, if you want to correlate the 2 things that are closest in terms of their correlation are Iranian influence and chaos and instability in the region. Yes. It's a very easy case to make. The Iraq War opened the gates for Iran to have influence. That was not sort of a deep strategic plot on the part of Iran. We enabled them, and then they benefited from from geographic proximity and sectarian identity, or at least proximity as well. Lebanon, again, we don't have to go through the story, but Iranian influence in Lebanon is almost directly a result of what Israel did in southern Lebanon, and then the rise of a Shiite constituency, and Iran exacerbating and taking advantage of that. Syria, as I said, it had influence before 2011. It only grew as the civil war grew in intensity, and the Assad regime turned to one of its few allies, its only ally, really, state ally in the region, which was Iran. And Yemen, again, there may have been some ties between the Houthi and Iran before 2011. Those only deepened as the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthi coalition were at war, and the Houthis turned again to one of the only allies they had in the region. So if you think, number one, I think we have to put the Iranian threat in perspective and understand, and I'm sure we could go through it step by step, how much do they really threaten interests, even if they are often a foe that we have to handle, but not exaggerate. But then if we are going to handle it, let's handle it the right way. And the worst way is to exacerbate conflict, to pour fuel on the fire, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's elsewhere. That's exactly what makes it easy for Iran, because Iran knows the region better than we do, knows how to deal with chaos better than we do, is of the region in a way that we're not. And all that makes it much easier for them to expand their influence when there's conflict, because when there's a conflict, there's always be one side that's going to turn to Iran against us in order to promote their interests.
Right. I mean, Ali, to you, I don't want to trivialize the nature of the Iranian threat. I mean, I don't think it's the threat to the fulcrum of Western civilization, as many people, or some in Washington do. So my question is, if you define American vital interests with respect to Iran as three elements: stopping terrorism, all right, let's define them narrowly, against Americans; maintaining freedom of navigation and access of oil; and three, preventing Iran from emerging as a regional hegemon with a nuclear weapon. Some might say that the smart policy in Iran is to cooperate with the Iranians when it's in our interests, and to confront them, seriously confront them, when in fact they threaten our red lines. Is that a sensible policy for the United States?
It is sensible if the debate, as Rob said, was not so ideological and polarized. And it's interesting that sometimes in practice that happens, maybe by default, like in Iraq. In Iraq, there was an implicit, not direct cooperation between Iran and the U.S. in the fight against ISIS. Maybe long-term objectives are different, but at least tactical short-term objective in fighting ISIS was there, and it happened. In Syria, even one can say to a certain degree. In Yemen, that's not the case. Or in Afghanistan, it happened in the early 2000s. But the point I want to make is, if you look at this from the perspective of Iranian officials, and part of my job description is to talk to them and try to understand their hopes and fears, is completely opposed to anything that people in this city can even dream of, which is that they view their role in the region not as in a hegemonic light, but in a very defensive way. They argue that because they don't have in terms of conventional military capability, anything compared to their neighbors, right? I mean, the GCC outspends Iran by a factor of 8, and it has access to cutting-edge U.S. And European military technology. They don't have a guarantor of their security like a lot of countries in the region do, like Turkey is a member of NATO. They feel themselves surrounded by U.S. forces. Every day they look off their shores in the Persian Gulf, they see 40,000 U.S. troops. So as a result of that, they have developed two defensive capabilities. One is the ballistic missile program, and that's why they say it's non-negotiable, because it's what they see as the only viable deterrence that they have. And second is what they call their forward defense policy, which is this idea of having proxies away from your borders so that you can deter an attack on your soil. And you talk to Iranian officials from across the political and institutional spectrum, even those who are seen in a more moderate, pragmatist light. There is no debate about the utility of Hezbollah for Iran. And there is no debate about whether Iran should have supported Assad or not, because they would, in their mind, if Assad had fallen and replaced by a regime that is closer either to the Israelis or to the Saudis, then the dominoes would start falling and Iran would be encircled again. So this is how they see it, and that's why I think there's absolutely no overlap between how Washington sees it and how Tehran sees it.
It's Mars and Venus, for sure. Laura, one for you, and you're welcome to comment, certainly, on what Ali said. I want to move on also to the JCPOA. Do you think what's happening internally, a much debated question, in Iran will have any impact at all on the way Iran carries out its activities and policies in the region, either as a function of budgetary constraints or political sensitivity? It appears that, and maybe I'm not correct on this, that one of the laments and complaints had to do with how the state budget was being allocated.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of popular control over that.
Right. that I
So
see.
no, I don't think that the Iranian state will be responsive to those complaints on the street. I wanted to add on the regional question that I do think the sort of the ideological way that we approach it does also tend to obscure the deficiencies of the Iranian foreign policy, in the sense that one sees one's adversary as all powerful, but in fact this is a very volatile region, and the fact that chaos has followed the Iranian presence in these capitals may not only be because Iran is sowing chaos, but it may be because Iran is in over its head. And I think you could make a case that Iran has overextended itself in the region and will not have an easy time in sustaining its influence, particularly in Iraq, where you have sectarian problems that Iran cannot solve. So I just kind of wanted to flag that as something that if we're going to look rationally at how we engage with Iranian influence in these capitals, I think we would have to also to acknowledge its limits, because it isn't an ironclad relation. This is not the Soviet Union.
No, fair enough. I mean, but a counterpoint would be that you have a unique situation in the Arab world where the three most important Arab states that have determined the shape and influence of regional politics, Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, are all essentially, even Egypt, offline. I mean, it's a unique moment in the history of this region where the Arab world, leading advocates, the ones that have the capacity, arguably, though it may be, to project their power abroad, simply cannot do so. And that leaves the very tantalizing notion, I've made this point before, that the three most important states in this region are the three non-Arabs: Israel, Iran, and Turkey, despite what's happening on the ground in Turkey and in Iran, and some would argue in Israel as well. These are functional states. They are stable domestically. They have tremendous economic potential, and they all have militaries and intelligence organizations that are quite formidable. So there is that argument to be made that, yes, you have to recognize Iranian limitations, but there are opportunities which have never existed before
That's true.
for a rising Tehran. So let's move on to the final segment. And Rob made an interesting point earlier. Had we conducted this panel 2 weeks ago, we would have been focused almost exclusively on Iran internal, and now actually the JCPOA is in the news given the president's announcement. So let me start. Anybody can take this one. You know, I live on planet Earth, not in a galaxy far, far away. This agreement, and I'm a Rolling Stones fan besides, everybody got what they needed out of this agreement, not what they wanted. And it's flawed but functional. I mean, that's how I would describe it. And it's certainly not transformational. It was a business proposition. It was a deal designed to accomplish certain limited ends. And anybody who would sell it as anything more than that, I would argue, wasn't thinking clearly, either at the time and certainly not now. So here's the question, maybe to Rob Malley. All this talk now about improving, strengthening, creating a supplemental agreement to deal with the JCPOA. Forget whether or not it's doable. I suspect it probably isn't doable. But is my reading of this agreement, I mean, actually, Rob, you were there. Is flawed but functional a fair way to describe the JCPOA?
The deal isn't perfect there. I've said it, I've admitted it. If people wanted to sort of waiting for that moment, of course it's not perfect. I mean, again, it's one of those debates that I find completely surreal. This was not a capitulation. It wasn't a surrender. It was a negotiation. It was a compromise. By definition, we didn't get everything we wanted. By definition, the Iranians didn't get everything they wanted. So to talk about a flaw of the deal is a misnomer. It's the deal, right? I mean, you could say, you know, why didn't you get everything you wanted? Because there was another side with whom we were negotiating. Now, you've negotiated deals. And by the way, parenthetically, you said together we've been in many Mission Impossibles.
Just
That's
one?
right. Well, Syria, Israel, and Palestine, Israel. This one, and you said maybe one day we'll get one that succeeds. This one succeeded. I'm not sure for how long, but we did get the Iran deal. But the fact that, you know, when you end a negotiation like this, you always look back and you think, well, the fact that the Iranians agreed to this means that they probably could have agreed to a little bit more, right? We weren't at the bottom line. I'm sure they think the same thing. I'm sure Zarif goes to bed and thinks, well, I got this much from the Americans. Maybe if I'd held off for a little more, I would have gotten more. So I think that debate about, is it a flaw of the deal, as you say, was intended to do one thing, which was to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon for a significant period of time, giving us time to then, to see what happens, and at least not to live with the specter of a war, which, as you'll remember, not long ago, people were saying we're on the brink of war. If Iran acquires more 20% enriched uranium, Israel is going to attack. So that's not the debate anymore. And so now we've moved on to another debate because that was chief. So number one, I find that whole discussion, was it the perfect deal or not? I find it almost irrelevant. Can it be other things that are done? Something that you raised. Yes, of course. I mean, most arms control agreements have follow-on agreements. They have other things, but 3 preconditions for that to happen. Number one, you have to implement the deal that you have in good faith, and you can't start violating it, a month, a year, 2 years after it's been signed, and that's number one. Number two, you have to negotiate with the party with whom you want to follow on agreement. And number three, if you're going to negotiate with that party, you're going to have to be prepared to make reciprocal concessions. None of those 3 is accepted by the Trump administration. It seems to be prepared to violate the agreement, and of course the Iranians would say they're violating it already by trying to discourage trade and investment. That's that's one piece. They are not prepared to talk to the Iranians about this, right? I mean, they're saying that what they want to do is to get Congress and Europe to rewrite a deal that was signed with Iran. And number 3, I've not heard of any reciprocal step, of which there may be many, that the Iranians would be prepared to consider in exchange for steps that they could take to prolong the duration of the deal, to bring missiles, perhaps, although as Ali says, that may be a bridge too far. But you could imagine that conversation. But we've set it up in a way that is not designed to improve the deal. In my view, it's designed to collapse it, to destroy it. Whether in the next 120 days or after, I think unfortunately, the steps are being taken to lead not to an effort to salvage it, but to torpedo.
Yeah, the president has now not certified, but waived sanctions. I think this is the 3rd time.
Yeah,
In a
but they
year.
have done it 9 times, but in 3 rounds.
Right. But this time, there are a couple additions. Number one, he set conditions. And number 2, I think, as Rob pointed out, he's delivered. Now, he's walked away from other multilateral agreements, TPP and Paris Climate. His advisors appear to have had an impact on him. The fact that you have R's and D's in Congress who are worried about walking away from the deal has had an impact on him. And perhaps the notion that there is no plan B once the deal is done, and then there's the cat and mouse game of who gets blamed for walking away. So my question to you is, the next 3 to 4 months, what is possible, do you think, with the Europeans? How much, leaving the Chinese and the Russians out of it, the 3 M's, who are they, May, Macron, and Merkel, the ones the president either doesn't get along with so well or does. He seems to be more inclined to listen to the Israelis and the Saudis when it comes to Iran than the Europeans. But is there any give? You wrote the report, and there's a lot in there on counterfactuals and contingencies with respect to Europeans. And I suggest everyone take a look at the ICG report. It's exceptionally well done. Any give there?
Honestly, I don't think so, because the administration has put the bar so high that it's unreachable. And let's also remember that the Europeans have said repeatedly over the past year that the deal itself is not open for renegotiation, right? So they don't want to reopen the deal. This is a deal that was delicately balanced. There were painstaking negotiations over 2.5 years. Before that, there was 12 years of standoff. So they don't want to reopen this deal. The only possibility is a supplemental agreement. And again, as Rob described, the administration is not prepared to give anything and is not even prepared to engage other members of the P5+1. I mean, imagine Federica Mogherini, the EU chief foreign policy officer, who heads the Joint Commission of the deal of the JCPOA. She is also equally responsible and accountable to Russia and China as the European members of the Joint Commission. She can't exclude them. She can't exclude the Iranians, who are also equal member of the Joint Commission. And even if everybody was prepared to negotiate, what the president said would be acceptable to him, which is unlimited restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, is just simply not in the cards. The Iranians would never accept that under any circumstances, right? So I just don't see where the give is, unless the administration knows that this is not an achievable goal and wants to use this to say, I gave you an opportunity to get a better deal and you didn't cooperate with me, so now I withdraw from the deal.
Laura, to you and I know you don't speak on behalf of the 80 million Iranians, but question, was there the sense on the streets among the elites that this was to be a transformative moment that would offer concrete deliverables?
I think that the deal, it certainly was a major moment, and it was also a major win for President Rouhani and his faction in government, which came not easily at the time. And yes, there was for that faction of the elite prestige and credibility riding on not just on concluding the deal, but on the notion that the United States could be dealt with. And the countervailing argument was that, coming from the hardliners, specifically even from the Supreme Leader, was that the Americans, you could negotiate this deal if you like, but they won't hold their end of it. And unfortunately, yes, the developments here have served the hardline narrative that, in fact, the United States is not a trustworthy negotiating partner. So that would be some fallout on the domestic political scene. It would certainly serve that narrative more than the narrative of those who sought diplomatic engagement.
Before we go to all of your questions, let me ask my final one on Rouhani is Gorbachev. I mean, the three of you are going to forget more about Iranian internal politics than I'm ever going to know, but this notion has been percolating. Is this an opportunity, or are these circumstances so fraught for Rouhani that, given the nature of the way the deck is stacked and who wields power in Iran, that this cannot be a moment for him? It's my suspicion that constraints are much greater than opportunities. But can any of the three of you speak to this question?
I think Rouhani's is not the first president to have been identified as the Iranian Gorbachev. Khatami before him was so described.
Maybe that's the answer.
I think that it is in fact the case that the constraints on the presidency are real, and that the presidency is a limited position in the Iranian power structure. And the limits are enforced by the security establishment and the judiciary and the Revolutionary Guard. There are a lot of vested interests that are not really that are not inclined to a reform program. And I think that Gorbachev it's not for nothing that you raised that name. I think that 1989 was frightening for the Iranian regime, and the notion that reform could lead to wholesale change has never been far from Khamenei's consciousness, and that this is part of the reason for the brittleness of the Iranian regime, and the fear of allowing for a degree of accountability. There are definitely moments, including this one, where you just sort of look at their response and you think, if you just let a little bit of air in, this would serve even your own designs, and yet they don't. And I think that is partly for fear that to bend is to break.
I think one way to, I don't want to add much at all to what Laura said, but one way to answer your question just with another question. I mean, if Rouhani is the Iranian Gorbachev, who's the Russian Khamenei? And that, I think, shows a difference between, at least one difference among many between the two.
Yeah.
two cases.
Ali?
And I would argue more of being an Ayatollah Gorbachev. Rouhani, I think, is the ultimate Ayatollah Machiavelli of the system. You know, he's the consummate insider. He knows the system inside out. And if there is a way to push for a reform, I think he's the one who can figure out the right balance between addressing the concerns of the system and addressing the grievances of the population. It's interesting. I just give you two other data points in addition to what Laura said. In 1977, the entourage of the Shah went to him and they told him, look, we need serious reform. The system is at a deadlock. And he agreed. He agreed to open up the system politically. But it was too little, too late, and the revolution came. In 1989, at the last year of Khomeini's life, Khamenei, Rafsanjani, and others went to him and they told him, there is serious deadlock in this system and we need change. And Khomeini agreed. And he started a process of reforming, changing, amending the constitution, and he died before the process was done. But that was an example of ill-conceived reform, because the changes that they did by abolishing the office of the prime minister actually created more friction in the system rather than reducing the tensions. So there is a good case to make to Ayatollah Khamenei, I think, that if he wants his legacy to be a stable system, and I think that's one reason that he agreed to the nuclear compromise, which for him was not even easy. I mean, dealing with the great Satan from his perspective, he had to come up with new lexicon describing it as heroic flexibility, to deal with the U.S. But I think the reason he did it was that he wanted to make sure, with his succession looming in the horizon, that the system is on a stable footing. And I think Rouhani and others can now make a convincing case to him
It's interesting.
that if he wants his legacy to survive, the system to survive, he has to open the door to some kind of reform.
I mean, highly repressive ideological states can change incrementally. I mean, China, Russia, Vietnam, Cuba, by opening up economically, but they seem to be able to maintain their repressive capacities. And I suspect that's what we're going to see in years ahead. Thank the three of you for a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Now let's go to your questions. Can I remind everybody, no station identification other than your name and affiliation, and your question. Yes. Where are we here? Way in the back on my left. Yeah.
Hi, Rachel Oswald with Congressional Quarterly. Assuming that President Trump does intend to make good on his threat to not renew sanctions waivers again if there's no deal reached, what then should the EU and other supporters of the deal, including members of Congress, do if they're going to take the president at his word that he really means he's not going to do another waiver and there is no possibility of getting a supplemental agreement to the Iran deal? Thoughts?
Why don't we take one more and then we can see who wants to answer them. Down here, yes, second row. Mike is coming, but if you...
Thank you. My name is Phil Carrata. I'm retired. I have two questions. One is, have you seen any indication of foreign subversive activities in the recent Iranian protests? I've had some Iranian friends who have said they have seen videos of MEK operating in Western Iran. So, one, is there any, was foreign subversion part of this? Second question is, this is more of an opinion, but looking at the geography of the Middle East, most of the countries there are very young countries, less than 100 years old. And Iran, in contrast, is a very old country, and it's been in continuous existence for thousands of years, and it has a relatively, I mean, a partially functioning democracy, high levels of education. The role of women is bigger. Would it not be in the U.S. interest to promote a stable Iran as a stabilizing factor for the rest of the region? Thank you.
All right, so we have 3 questions. Rob, why don't you take the first one?
I'll take the first one, but I will let Ali expand, because that question that Rachel asked is really what our report is about and what a piece that Ali wrote about today. And I'm gonna summarize it very, very simply. I think there is room still to see whether some kind of deal is possible with President Trump. He's been known in the past to set high bars, and then, as Ali said, this is a pretty high one, but if he could have a win, then maybe he would sell it, even though it doesn't really violate the JCPOA. I think it's possible. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's incumbent on members of Congress and on the Europeans to see whether there's some way to scratch that itch without violating the JCPOA. Where Crisis Group and where we come down, though, is anything that would be a violation of the JCPOA should be avoided at all costs by Europe and by Congress. In other words, what I think the president wants is, and he's made it pretty clear, he wants Congress to agree on legislation that would automatically snap back sanctions, even if Iran were living with were complying with the deal, but were doing activities that after some of the constraints expire, they then do activities that are permitted by the deal, but that President Trump would not want them to do, or if they engage in some missile activities or other steps, again, compliant with the deal, but not compliant with what the standard that President Trump has put forward. He would like Congress to pass that legislation that would automatically impose sanctions. And he wants the Europeans to say they, too, would impose sanctions under those circumstances. So it's not really a renegotiation of the deal, but it's a violation of the deal to the extent that Iran was told, here are certain things you can't do, here are certain things you can or will be able to do, and now they're going to be told you're going to be sanctioned for activity that you thought you'd be able to do. That, even for the sake of trying to save the deal, to go down that road, our advice to Congress, our advice to the Europeans is don't go down that road, because that's killing the deal kindly. I mean, it's basically doing the same thing, but with congressional and European imprimatur, which makes matters worse. And by the way, it's not clear, again, that President Trump, he may live up to his threat, but it's a pretty bad situation for the United States to be in. If the United States decides it's going to pull the plug on the deal without any evidence, any indication that Iran has violated it, it will be isolated. The rest of the world will side with Iran. It won't be able to restore sort of the international consensus on sanctions. And therefore, if anything, Iran will be in the driver's seat, and the U.S. will be in a much worse position than it is today. So by holding firm on not doing anything that steps on the JCPOA, I think Congress and the Europeans could be in a stronger position. As I said, not at the expense of looking, is there a way forward that would allow President Trump to declare victory without violating the JCPOA? But not to bend over backwards to try to find a compromise if it's at the cost of the survival of the deal. Just one very quick on Phil's question about foreign subversive activities. I've seen no evidence of it. Is it possible? Yes. Do I think if it occurred, that it had any significant impact on the course of events in Iran? No, but some of my colleagues may know better.
Any thoughts on external manipulation or intervention in the last several weeks? Any indications? Have seen anything like that?
No, I agree with what Rob said, but there's been a set of statements that have basically provided justification for the Iranian government, and especially the Supreme Leader put his finger on this, that there's been a triangle of a collusion between the triangle of Iranian enemies, the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia, plus dissidents like MEK, to destabilize the system. And, when they see in New York Times first page saying that the CIA has appointed the Dark Prince, the guy who got bin Laden to be in charge of Iran, or Mohammed bin Salman says that we will take instability inside Iran's borders, they use that as justification to say there is an external threat. But obviously, we don't have any evidence that they were behind this.
Yeah, I mean, one just additional comment. I was never what I would call a cheerleader for the Accord, but it now has much greater significance on an issue that is not in the Middle East, and that is, how would a walkaway affect KJU's any sense? I mean, he clearly is not ready to negotiate now, but a walkaway might constrain and or impede his own calculations in terms of the value of doing any sort of business with the Trump administration. And that is the real nuclear threat that we face, the real one.
Can I also make a follow-up point
Sure.
on the European angle? We in this report we did a survey of more than 60 business leaders, and this is the creme de la creme of business executives who are looking at opportunities to do business with Iran. And they play an important role in the deal's implementation because at the end of the day, the bargain was about nuclear restrictions on the one hand and economic benefits on the other. And if business is reluctant to engage Iran, obviously the other end of the bargain doesn't work. The results are quite interesting. Some of it you would expect, like 79% of businesses that we surveyed, they told us that they had delayed engaging the Iranian market in the past 2 years. So not just the Trump factor, but also under President Obama. The reason is because they were afraid of existing U.S. sanctions and the snapback, possible snapback of U.S. sanctions. And they're quite jittery about U.S. sanctions generally when we ask them what's the main primary obstacle for you to enter the Iranian market. 57% put their fingers on U.S. sanctions, followed by a great distance, about 11%, to internal deficiencies of Iran's market, like corruption or lack of legal protection, that kind of issues. And the interesting and new aspect of this, because some of our friends often say, if European companies are really pushed by the Trump administration and they're faced with a choice between the 13 trillion U.S. economy and 400 billion Iranian economy, it's a very obvious choice. And a lot of companies that we surveyed actually agree with this point. But interestingly, a striking majority, 63%, told us that they believe the deal can survive without the U.S. And then when we asked them what's the condition that you think this could happen, 54% told us that if Iranians remain committed to the deal, and the EU creates a legal protection for its companies. These are called blocking regulations, which is basically an EU law that bans European companies from complying with unilateral extraterritorial US sanctions, that they're still willing to do business with Iran. And even between 2006 and 2011, at the height of sanctions regime, 30% of these companies were still doing business with Iran. So if you think about between 30% and 50% of the companies are willing to do business with Iran, even without the U.S., I think it's really time now for the Europeans to stand up and show that they're serious in preserving the deal, going beyond rhetorical support and provide legal protection for their companies. And I think that's the way to save the deal, regardless of the volatility that we see in the city around the deal.
Okay. How about right here, fourth or fifth row? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Hopefully we'll get both in.
Ava Spolin, retired State Department. If you were a European, would you be trying to consider to be talking to the Iranians about trying to set up some kind of follow-on negotiation that would protect the existing agreement, but that would provide enough of a win for Trump, and that would allow negotiations to go on indefinitely? Is that something that has any kind of future? And just a short question about what the last speaker said. How would EU blocking legislation help companies if they can't do business in the United States in the event of?
Avis, it's great to see you. Ali, do you want to take those two?
Sure. So on your last question, so these are some of the companies that have either de-risked themselves from the U.S. market, meaning that they've reduced their footprint here, or they have put in force majeures in their contracts to protect themselves. So these are some of the carve-outs that some of these companies have used. But interestingly, there's actually precedent for this. In the late 1990s, when the Clinton administration enacted the Iran-Cuba Sanction Act, the Europeans came up with this blocking regulation. That's the first time they introduced it. And it served as a deterrent. The Clinton administration never enforced its sanctions. Even the Bush administration never enforced its sanctions. It was the Obama administration that started enforcing them, and then eventually the Europeans joined, and the blocking regulations faded away. They're still in the books, but they're not being implemented. So there is precedent for that. And on your first question, maybe I'll let Rob.
Well, listen, the answer is yes and no. In other words, I think, and it's building on what I said earlier, I think it's conceivable, and when I talk to the Europeans, they also think, yes, there's things that we'd like to see in a follow-on agreement, but they can't have that conversation with the Iranians while the current agreement is on such shaky grounds as it is. So I think what they are or should be telling the U.S. administration is we're prepared to talk to the Iranians about other things that are in your interest, in our interest, but we can't do that and hold a gun to the head of the JCPOA. Let's firm up the JCPOA, let's make clear we're not going to touch it, and then we can have a conversation with the Iranians. It won't be an easy one, and the Iranians may prove to be quite difficult customers in that, but they may also be open, again, because there's some things they want. To begin with, they'd like the lifting of our primary embargo, so there are things that we still have in our pockets, quite a few, that we could give them in exchange for what we want. So I think our view is the Europeans could get to that conversation. I don't see how it could take place today. Why would Iran be prepared to talk about a follow-on agreement when they think the agreement the ink is barely dry, is being violated, and may be extinguished in a matter of 120 days?
Yes, over here. Oh, yes.
Ralph Nurnberger, Georgetown. Two questions. One, could you comment on the role of Israel on this? Netanyahu wants the agreement scrapped, but the Israeli intelligence and military seem to think that it would be wise to continue it. And second, the Trump administration, particularly the vice president, said that the U.S. did not do enough under Obama in 2009. We need to do more, but doesn't quite say exactly what more is, and would more be counterproductive?
Thanks, Ralph. Let's take one or two more. Yes, right here.
Greg Thielman, board member of the Arms Control Association. Opponents of the JCPOA treat ballistic missiles as one of the fundamental flaws of the agreement, the absence of any constraints on them. And yet they seem to characterize Iran's ballistic missiles in a way that's more suitable to North Korea, steady progress toward ICBMs, when Iran has no nuclear warheads. They have no missiles with ranges over 2,000 kilometers. So what is the principled approach to Iran on ballistic missiles, even if there's acceptance of JCPOA? What is the next step on ballistic missiles? What's in it for Iran?
On the do more question, who wants that one?
Go ahead.
Well,
Did you want to? Or
I was going to actually second something that you had said earlier, Rob, about so this notion that American intervention at a moment of crisis in Iran, that there is that what is said here in Washington substantially affects the course of events on the ground. I'm skeptical about that as well. I think. And I don't think that the Trump administration has made clear exactly what it means by do more, what it believes should have been done in 2009, or what should be done at this moment. Certainly, the announcement on the JCPOA doesn't seem to speak to that.
And I'd add another point, Ralph, and I think either Ali or Laura were making it earlier. The Europeans may have had some impact, we don't know, in terms of restraining the Iranian repression, which, there was a high degree of repression, but much less than what some might have thought, and less than happened in the past. And that could be because the Europeans had leverage. They were abiding by the deal. This was the Iranians didn't want to alienate them. We kind of lost that leverage. I mean, frankly, I don't think anything that President Trump said at a time when in the eyes of the Iranians, he was in favor of regime change. He'd barred Iranians from entering the country. He'd, basically labeled them every possible thing in the world and then some, and wanted to undo the deal. So it's not what leverage did we have, but I do think that there are circumstances where if as the Europeans showed, perhaps, that not by speaking necessarily that loudly, but by making clear, publicly and privately, that certain steps are going to lead to deterioration in relations and could have consequences that would be costly to the Iranians. So I think, unfortunately, this whole debate also has been clouded by the fact that the administration was the worst messenger for any message, regardless of how significant or insignificant it would have been. I think there was another question about Israel's role in this and Israel's views, I think also by Ralph. There's a divide in Israel, kind of mirroring to some extent the divide here, where you have some people in the administration who think that you should tank the deal, and then by all accounts, the military security experts are saying the opposite. They're saying the last thing we want to do today is deal with a artificial, U.S.-generated crisis, nuclear crisis with Iran, when we have a genuine one, as Aaron said, that we really have to deal with in North Korea. So I think, and in Israel, this goes back a long time. As you know, there's been a debate in Israel about even those who don't like the deal, and I think the security establishment doesn't particularly like it, they much prefer it today to the alternative of tanking it. And I'm not sure where Netanyahu is, frankly, but I know that where the security establishment is, for political reasons, the prime minister may be somewhere else, just as for political reasons, some people here may not be where our Secretary of Defense, for example, seems to be.
I'd only add that you have an inherently, preternaturally risk-averse prime minister. I mean, any analysis of Benjamin Netanyahu from his first term and now from his successive terms would suggest he's very reluctant. Risk-averse in Lebanon, risk-averse in Gaza, risk-averse on the peace process. I think he can have it both ways. He's not going to get in front of Donald Trump, clearly, not now. At the same time, he knows that his security establishment believes that buying as much time as possible is better than creating a situation where you could see the enrichment activities continue, and then the same problem that the Israelis face, operating at the limits of their military capacity, he'd be in a position where he might have to actually act. And that, I think, is a scary proposition, no matter how bold and tough his words are.
Aaron, if I can answer
yes.
Greg's question on ballistic missiles. I think you're right in the sense that the administration is getting the issue upside down. But their argument is if we don't address Iran's ballistic missile program, it will eventually become the North Korean program. But I think the problem is, and this is why I'm quite pessimistic about prospects of any kind of agreement on the ballistic missiles, is because the Iranians don't have any alternative to it as a reliable deterrent, as a conventional deterrent. Maybe in 2020, and this is what I'm going to say is blasphemy in this city, but maybe in 2020 when UN arms embargo is lifted and they can get more advanced weaponry, maybe then it would lose its value to the system. But at this stage, I just can't imagine it. And they've already limited, as you said, the range to 2,000 kilometers, which covers the region, but it's not an intercontinental ballistic missile that could reach the US. I don't see how they can go beyond that. Their focus at the moment is on accuracy, but absent a regional agreement that takes into account that the Saudis and Israelis have ballistic missiles that are much longer range than the Iranians. Plus, the Iranians, the Iranian Air Force dates back from the time of the Shah as a flying museum. I just don't see how they can come to any kind of compromise on that.
We can take two more questions, I think. Let's take them both at the same time. Down here, Amy?
Thank you. Amy Austin-Holmes at the Wilson Center. I have a question about the protests. As you mentioned, they spread to 80 or some cities in Iran, but from what I understand, there were fewer protests in Tehran than in 2009, and I was just wondering if any of you had any explanation as to why that is, or if that's even the case, that there were fewer protests in Tehran than other parts of the country. And also if you have any insights as to whether this domestic unrest in Iran might lead to less engagement in Iraq, for example, especially now with the negotiations going on between Erbil and Baghdad. I'd be curious to hear if you have any thoughts as to what may happen there with Iranian influence.
Let's take one more, and then we'll be done. Way in the back. Uh-oh. There we go.
Hi, my name is Farzin Illich. I'm also a stable genius, but maybe not so stable, but definitely a genius. So I really appreciate the admission of ignorance. I think that's refreshing honesty. But I think it's more than lack of knowledge. The problem is lack of imagination. So you put out all these reports, it's an existential question, and they don't make any impact. And so you spend a lot of money. Some people go to church, some people go to mosque. You guys put out reports. And don't you think it would be useful to direct this energy into something that may actually have an impact in the world?
Can I just, I'll take that question in the spirit in which it was offered, although I'm not entirely sure what that spirit is. And let me be very clear. I mean, you could say that not just about the International Crisis Group. You could make that charge, that claim, against any of the research institutes, the universities, the think tanks in Washington or throughout the country. And I would only respond to you, believe me, I understand the limitations of written products in actually influencing anything or changing the course of anything. However, clear and honest analysis, trying to understand the way the world is with all of the complexities that that provides is essential before policymakers act to try to change it. And I think, frankly, that having followed ICG for many years and having been here at the Wilson Center, that if you look at what in fact these reports actually try to do, I think that you would suggest that the key to fixing the world, or trying to fix it, is first understanding it. And ICG goes a long way, frankly, to trying to do that. And now, in a fact-free environment, it seems to me to be essential that we continue to look for the best and most honest and clearest analysis that we can find. And I think, again, I'll say it again, I think ICG provides it. I think the three panelists have done it today, and please join me in thanking them for a sensational presentation.